Yeah, so I just relocated back to Austin, actually. Been in New York for the last 4 years. I'm at Amazon now, leading the homepage personalization team. So all those really, really terrible recommendations you get for toilet paper, yeah, we're going to try to make that better. But I spent the last 4 years leading the machine learning and recommendations team at Spotify in New York. So my talk today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about one such feature that we released at Spotify. It's called Discover Weekly. And I want this to be kind of like story time. I want to tell you a little bit about the story of where Discover Weekly came from and kind of the lessons I've learned along the way on building recommendation products at scale. So we're all data folks here, so I thought, why not start with a slide on data at Spotify? So if you're not familiar with Spotify, it's a music streaming company. It started in 2006. It's now available in 58 markets. These numbers are a little bit old, actually. So these are the public numbers. Spotify has 75 million active users. It's actually a lot larger than that now. 20 million of which pay. So over a quarter of people pay for Spotify. There's 30 million songs on Spotify, 20,000 new songs added per day. On user-generated data, there's 2 billion user-generated playlists on Spotify. Also on top of that, another 2 terabytes of user data gets logged per day. What users are listening to, what they're clicking on, what are they searching for, that kind of stuff. Previously, when I actually created this slide, Spotify had their own in-house 2,000 node Hadoop cluster. They announced just a couple weeks ago that they've now moved to Google Cloud Services. That was in the works for a while. And at Spotify, we were running around 10,000 plus Hadoop jobs a day. OK, so here's a challenge. 30 million songs on Spotify, but how do you find the right song for the right user? So when I first started at Spotify, this was kind of the first feature we worked on. It was called Radio. It's essentially, if you're familiar with Pandora but not familiar with Spotify, this is Spotify's version of Pandora. So start a radio station seeded by an artist or a song or even a playlist, and we serve up music that's similar to that song or artist or playlist. Kind of in tandem to that, we were working on another feature, early feature called Related Artists, which is essentially that. You go to an artist's page, we serve you up artists that are similar to that artist. So here, you navigate to the Fleet Foxes page, you see other artists, Band of Horses, Bon Iver, artists like that are similar to Fleet Foxes. So our first personalized recommendation feature that we launched, we call it the Discover page. When it launched back in 2013, it was actually the homepage of Spotify. That's since changed. This is what it looks like now. It's gone through a few iterations. But essentially, this is a page for all of our 75 plus million active users that you can navigate to, and it has a bunch of recommended content for you based on what you listen to. So you can, if you're familiar with Netflix, this sort of looks a lot like Netflix, right? You've got different strips of content. The top is just top recommendations for you, new releases for you, or you get these strips of content here, like I must have been listening to Joey Badass, and so I got a bunch of albums similar to Joey Badass. And then finally, just in July of last year, we released our latest feature. It's called Discover Weekly. It's essentially a mixtape of 30 songs, personalized to all of our users, and you get a new one every Monday. So every Monday, you log into Spotify, and you've got this personalized mixtape kind of waiting for you. And the story I kind of want to tell you today is how this wasn't really a company priority. This wasn't something that was handed down from the top, and we had been planning on. There's all these news articles like, oh, this is like, the Apple Music killer is Discover Weekly, and they've been planning this for months. No, none of that happened. This was like purely an organic bottom-up feature that a small agile team of 4 engineers worked on. And so that's kind of the story I want to tell, is like, how did we land on this thing? And like, we're not prepared for the kind of praise it got. So I just kind of want to talk about that narrative. So yeah, here is some of the press. In the first 10 weeks of Discover Weekly being launched, there were 1 billion tracks streamed from Discover Weekly. So if you do some of the math just on like the royalties that are getting paid out to artists, this is pretty awesome. Paying out a lot of royalties to artists based on this, and also connecting artists with fans that they wouldn't be connected with otherwise. So this was pretty awesome. So, okay, the road to Discover Weekly. How did we get here? So let's travel back first to 2013. I mentioned that this was our first personalized recommendations feature at Spotify. It's the Discover page. This is what it looked like in 2013. So it looks more like a news feed, kind of like Facebook, or we called it our Pinterest layout. So when we launched it, it was a personalized news feed of content. It had everything from artists we think you should like, playlists, concerts coming up in your area, even social stuff. So like you can follow the President Barack Obama, who's here today, and anything he does, it'll show up in your news feed, just like Facebook. So tons of content, and it was just kind of splattered on the page. We tried to rank it according to some machine learning models we had. So this was it. We launched this, and we launched it as the Spotify homepage. But what we found is this required a lot of attention and digging in order to engage with the content. So what we noticed is people would come in and they'd engage with it, but then eventually they'd kind of drop out and they'd go back to just listening to their playlists and things like that. So I think we learned really quickly that users don't always want the friction of having to find stuff. It's not like you wake up one day and you're like, oh, I'm in Discover mode and I want to just start digging through. Most users, they just want to hit a play button, more or less. So that's one thing we kind of figured out. The other problem is there was very little organization of the content. So suppose you wanted to find out concerts in your area. There wasn't a button you could click and just find concerts in your area. You had to scroll through this feed and actively find those concerts. So in 2014, we tried to improve on that organization a bit, and we launched our second iteration of a Discover page. And this is what's currently in the Spotify client now. So we tried to group all the content into strips, kind of like Netflix. So that's what you have here. So it's a lot more organized than that newsfeed layout we had. We also limited it to albums and new releases. So we got rid of all the social content, all the concerts, everything. We tried to make it very streamlined. It's a little, visually, it's a lot easier to kind of parse with your eyes. But again, we noticed the same thing. In tandem to releasing this, we also started testing another homepage that was just a bunch of human-curated playlists. We call that Browse. If you go to Spotify right now, that is the homepage. And what we noticed is, let me go to the next slide, actually. Yeah. What we noticed is users are spending way more time on editorial browse playlists than they were on their personalized Discover pages. Why is that? We have a personalized feed that's personalized to you, but users are spending more time in these playlists that are not personalized to you. So what's going on here? So one thing we think is going on here is, again, users, they don't want the friction of having to dig through content, right? We have power users that want that experience of going into the record store and browsing through records. But the average user doesn't want that. They want to come in, hit play, and just have awesome music presented to them. And editorial browse playlists were giving that to them. So we had an idea around this time. We said, OK, well, let's see is there a way that we can combine the personalized experience of Discover, but with the lean back ease of Browse? What am I doing on time? Not good. OK, so meanwhile, in 2014, we released this thing called Year in Music. So this was essentially like we took all your listening habits over the course of the year. And at the end of the year, we served up, here's your year in music, your 2014 year in music. And so you can see here's my Chris Johnson's 2014, what kind of music did I listen to. This is kind of a breakdown. I must have listened to like 30% indie rock, post-rock, indie pop, noise pop. Yeah, so you got that sort of analytics. And we decided, what if at the end of this thing, we served up this little present to all the users that actually scrolled through this big dump of their year in music and gave them a playlist of, hey, here's, you listen to tons of music in 2014. Well, here's some new stuff that you haven't heard before that you should check out. We called it Play It Forward. And it was just a little playlist of 30 songs that were personalized to all of our users. And we didn't really know what to expect. And it turns out, like a month later, millions of users are still listening to their personalized Play It Forward playlist. And we're like, holy crap, what's going on here? Like, we did not expect that. So this was kind of the first time when we were like, OK, I think we're onto something here. Like, people are engaging more with this than they were with the Discover page. So I think we kind of realized it, and we were like, OK, it's the playlist. Like, people love playlists. It's a really easy way to consume music, so let's run with this. So again, I have like 5 lessons I want to kind of dive into in this. And so this is lesson 1. And it's to be data-driven from start to finish. So what do I mean by that? So let me go to the next slide, actually. OK, yeah. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is kind of like Spotify over the years, OK? So in 2008, this is kind of how we operated at Spotify. Come up with an idea, spend the next 6 months or so building out that idea, and at the end of it, you release it. And a lot of companies that I talk to, they still operate in this model. This is problematic, right? You're engineering something, you're spending 6 months, and then you're just releasing it, but you're not refining that process, you're not learning from it. So this is wrong. 2012, we got a little bit better. It was more like this. Product team would come up with an idea, spend 6 months coding it up. At the end of that, we'd A/B test it. So we'd say, OK, let's give some small percent, let's give 10% of users this new experience and control the other 90% and see which one has better engagement. And at the end of that, we would decide, should we release this or should we not? Should we go back to the drawing board? So we're being a little more data-driven here, right? We're actually looking at data and seeing, was this a good thing or not? But to me, this still is not data-driven. Why is this not data-driven? Well, you're not looking at data early enough. So you've got this whole process where you could have validated your hypothesis earlier on. So by 2015, I think we kind of figured this out. And this is more the process of how Discover Weekly worked. So we had an idea. We validated it really early on with very little development work. We didn't try to scale this thing up. We validated it through sending this Play It Forward playlist out. From that, prototyped, A/B test. Again, don't scale everything up to all 100 million users. And you kind of refine from there. And so I think to be truly data-driven, it's this kind of continual process where validate early on, get some feedback, refine your process, and that's how it kind of works. OK. Yeah, so an important part of that, too, is that you really need to define your success metrics before you release your test. So I've seen this so many times at companies where they release an A/B test, they get some data back, and they try to interpret it after they've gotten the data back. And they're like, oh, well, this metric went up and this one went down. Well, this is the one we care about, so we're going to release this thing. And this is super problematic because you're going to try to make the data work for you. So I think it's super important to, before you release your test, define your success criteria. That way, it's completely objective, and you're not going to end up in this bias. So for Discover Weekly, we did just that. We said, OK, what do we care about? And I tend to do this a lot with features. I think this is kind of universal. What we kind of care about are 3 things: reach, depth, and retention. Reach is how many users are you reaching with your product. Depth is, for the users you are reaching, what is their depth of reach? So like, for example, with Discover Weekly, how many users are we reaching with Discover Weekly? For the users we do reach, how much time are they spending in Discover Weekly? And then retention is, for the users you do reach, how many do you retain? So we really care about long-term retention. We want users to stay with Spotify for a long time. That's difficult to measure. So instead, you typically measure a proxy like week-over-week retention. So here's the success metrics for Discover Weekly. And we came up with these before we even tested it. Reach, we decided, was going to be the fraction of Spotify users that weekly come in and use Discover Weekly. Because it's a weekly updated playlist, we couldn't really define daily metrics. There's a huge skew in how many users use it on Monday, for example. So we decided to go with weekly. Depth is time spent, the amount of time users spend out of the fraction of Discover Weekly users we have. And then retention is just week-over-week retention. For everyone that came in and played their Discover Weekly last week, what percentage of them came back? OK, yeah, so what's the next step? The next step was to build a prototype. So we initially did this with employees. Employees are a great place to start with building a prototype. So Spotify has 1,500 employees that are all music lovers, so we can get some really easy feedback early on. So the first thing we did was just that. We built a prototype. We generated Discover Weekly playlists for all employees at Spotify, didn't ask any questions, didn't ask for permission, and just clicked the button and sent out this playlist to everyone's library. And yeah, we were a little worried. I remember going to push the button, and I was like, oh crap, like, are people going to get pissed about this? Are we going to hear about this later? But I'm glad we pushed the button, because if we didn't, I don't know if Discover Weekly would have happened. So here was the initial employee tests. We pushed this thing out. This is what it looked like. It had this generic image of an astronaut on the moon, and had 30 songs. And we pushed this to all employees at Spotify. Didn't tell anybody, just kind of pushed it, and we were like, okay, organically people are going to find this thing. And that's what you sort of see here. So we actually built dashboards for the employee test, because we wanted to know, like, are employees going to find this thing, and are they going to use it? So here's our reach, depth, and retention metrics for employees. So you can see here, this is when we kind of pushed it to everybody, and we're like, all right, let's see if people are going to find it. You see like a few people find it here, a few more people find it here. All of a sudden, there's like, there's this word of mouth, and people started talking about it internally. Like, do you know about this Discover Weekly thing? Like, where did it come from? Like, who's working on this? And so it was weird. There was this like weird, like viral internal, like this secret playlist is all of a sudden like, is this launched? Is this live? Or is it just employees? Like, nobody really knew what was going on, even though in the description of the playlist we said this is an employee-only test. Don't worry. So we started looking at it. So what percentage of employees started listening to Discover Weekly? Within like, this is like a week's time here. Within a week's time, we've got like 40% of Spotify employees jamming on Discover Weekly every week. And we're like, wow, that's awesome. Of those, we were retaining almost 80% of them. So we were like, okay, this thing's pretty good. And we started gathering some feedback and improving the playlist with employees. So that was the prototype phase. Now that we had a good prototype that worked well for employees, the next step was let's A/B test this thing and get some feedback with real users. So the next step was, we're not building this for all users, just 1%. So we're not trying to scale up yet. We're still refining and testing. And we couldn't scale up to all users yet. We didn't have the infrastructure necessary. So the first thing we did was we tested with 1% of users. So here was the A/B test we did. We essentially, to 1% of Spotify users, we did the same thing. We didn't ask any questions. We just pushed this Discover Weekly playlist out to users. So we actually tested two versions of it, one which had this generic image, and then our designer had this cute idea of, because one question we had was, are users even going to realize this is personalized? And yeah, like we said, start off the week with these picks just for you in the description, but that's only so much real estate, and are users going to realize this is personalized? So we decided, okay, let's use the oldest trick in the book. Let's make their picture the album cover. So we had access for users that were connected to Facebook. We had access to their profile pictures. So our designer came up with this neat trick of, well, why don't we just download everyone's Facebook picture, and we'll just overlay it with Discover Weekly, and that'll tell you see this thing with your face on it. You're like, oh, that's mine. That's personalized to me. So we did that. And we wanted to test both of these because we wanted to know, is this going to have any impact on engagement? And if it does have an impact on engagement, we're going to have a lot more work on our hands, because dealing with CDNs and Facebook images is a lot of work. This was another cute thing we did. We threw in a link to a Google spreadsheet. So if you did get to this thing, you did find it, and you loved it, we gave a little link for these lucky 1% of users to give us some feedback on, rate it on a 1 to 5 star scale, give us some actual feedback on it. So this is the Google Forum 1% results. So you can see we got around 1,000 or so responses. On a 1 to 5 star scale, hugely loved it, mostly 5 stars. You can see some of the comments here. I'm loving Discover Weekly, always looking for new music. So people were generally liking it. One thing we were worried about, around the time that we did this, Apple was getting a lot of shit for having thrown U2's album on all new iPhones. And we were like, oh crap, people are going to be like, do not mess with my library. This is my library. Don't push a playlist on me. Out of these 1,000 responses, there were 3 that said something along those lines. So that kind of eased us a little bit. We're like, okay, that's a pretty small percentage of these responses. I think we'll be okay. Another cool thing me do it on time, is that that personalized image that I showed you where we took the Facebook profile and overlaid it with Discover Weekly, that ended up in a 10% lift in weekly active users. So just the same content, but just changing that image to be a personalized image, 10% lift in week AU. So that's what we were like, okay, the good is that's awesome. This thing's good. The bad is, okay, now we actually have to scale up this image overlay, and that's a lot of work. So yeah. So this is my second lesson. Reuse existing infrastructure in creative ways. Discover Weekly itself, it's really nothing new that we didn't already have. It's the same exact recommendation models. We're reusing the playlist, which we already had. So really, we're just presenting content in a different way. So I think there's a good lesson here that look at what you have and how can you reuse it in some interesting way that's creative and that can engage users. The other thing was little tricks, putting that Google form in the description or the personalized image. These aren't super new things. It's not a whole lot of infrastructure. It's just using the infrastructure you have, but in creative ways. And so that's how a small team is able to be innovative with very few resources. OK, so I know I'm running really low on time, so I'm going to try to get through this quickly. This is more or less the data flow for Discover Weekly at Spotify. So here's how it works. We've got users here connect to Spotify. They hit an access point. They go and play music on Spotify. They'll hit a backend service like radio, the artist page, a playlist. We funnel all of that log data through Kafka, which Andy mentioned earlier. It's a distributed publish-subscribe framework. So basically, all of our logs from separate backend services are all publishing logs of who played what. And then we have a subscriber to that Kafka topic that basically funnels all those play logs into Hadoop distributed file system. We run a bunch of Hadoop jobs, mostly scalding, on top of that, and generate collaborative filtering machine learning models on top of that. So our recommendations pipeline is essentially based on 3 sort of separate areas. Batch collaborative filtering models. So this is based on what people listen to, finding patterns in that. Batch NLP models, so we scrape the web. What kind of vocabulary are people talking about this artist using versus this artist? And then our batch audio models. So we actually train models on the raw audio content to understand the audio. And we kind of ensemble all this together. And then weekly, we generate a new Discover Weekly playlist for every user. We actually generate a new one every day. And this is more of a fail-safe for, Hadoop goes down, whatever. We've got a backup playlist. I'm not even going to go into that. OK, so lesson 3. Don't scale until you need to. This is super important. And that's going back to being data-driven from start to finish, right? Don't try to over-engineer. Don't try to scale up to 100% of your users. Test early. If you can test your new idea with 1% of users really easily, do that now. Don't try to scale this thing up until you need to. Yeah, I'm going to skip over that. OK. All right, so we finally get this thing out there. The A/B test results came back positive. Finally, able to release this thing to 100% of users. What do people think about it? Immediately, we started getting tons of feedback on Twitter. People loved it. It's scary how well Discover Weekly playlists know me. It's like a former lover who lived through a near-death experience with me. Yeah, what else do we have on here? It's like having a crush in university. Can't wait for the weekend to be over. Yeah. Anyway, it got a lot of positive reviews. So it was all over the news, all over the media. People were writing about this as it's like this thing that's been in the works at Spotify for forever, and it's going to be the Apple killer and all of this. And we were all snickering like, oh, this was something, I don't even know if our CEO knew we were building this thing. So we thought it was kind of funny the way it was written about. So this was kind of fun. About 2 weeks into Discover Weekly being launched, that problem I mentioned, like Hadoop going down, yeah, that happened. So we were not prepared for that. And this was the first time we had a feature where it was like, there's a schedule to it, right? If it doesn't show up on Monday, that's a bad thing. if the Discover page didn't update one day, we had some cute shuffling mechanism in place that would just shuffle stuff around. People wouldn't know. Discover Weekly doesn't update, people know. And people were pissed. And there were like news articles written about how like people woke up on Monday and there was no Discover Weekly. Like, my life is over. What is going on? It was really funny. There was tons of stuff about it. So here we have Caitlin Rush at Crush saying it's 10:41 and my playlist hasn't updated. I'm doing my best not to have an existential crisis. We've got Brian Barnett saying, I never knew how much I liked Discover Weekly playlist and didn't update today, and it sent me into a blind rage. So yeah, that was kind of fun. We learned from that, and I think we had one more minor issue since then, but we've gotten a lot better about that. Yeah, so I'm going to try to finish this up now since we're way over time. So what's next? The biggest thing is iterating on the content quality and interface enhancements. So this is more or less the world that Discover Weekly has moved to now, or is moving towards. So the idea is, there's a bunch of machine learning models. Some are collaborative filtering based, some are audio based, some are NLP based, and all of those get ensembled together using ensemble models, and from that generate your Discover Weekly recs. That in turn leads to your playlist. We then look at saves and skips. So what are people interacting with? What are they not interacting with? And that feeds back in this feedback loop. So always learning from our users to improve how we combine these signals. Now the problem with this is something called presentation bias. So you're only ever going to get feedback on stuff that we already thought was really good, right? So how are you ever going to step out of this little box you've kind of locked yourself in? And so one thing that you can do is this little trick called random sampling. So essentially what you do is you sample random negatives. You say, dip into the full catalog of 30 million songs and say, this random song, if I had given this to a user, they would have hated it. And in general, with 30 million songs, if you do that, you're probably going to be right. If I dipped into the Spotify catalog right now and I just handed you each a random card, chances are you're not going to like what I'm going to hand you. So this is kind of the way I like to view this. I like to view it as sort of a reinforcement learning problem. So at any point in time, we have this current view of the world, right? Where this is the feedback. So we have this view of the world, and some of the stuff we're recommending is positive, some of it's negative, and we're going to learn from that and take a step. And then we have a new view of the world. We get new feedback, and it's this ever kind of constant battle of generating recommendations, getting feedback, taking a step. Whereas there's this optimal view of the world we're always trying to get towards, but it's this dynamic machine. People's tastes are changing, so you never quite make it to the optimal view of the world. But you still try. So this is more or less how I like to think about it. OK, lesson 4. Last 2 slides, I think, are lessons. So this is really, really important, I think. Lesson 4 is users know best. In the end, A/B test everything. So I think this is really important, and I still see this at companies where, some product owner has an idea and they're just like so passionate about it, and they just want to launch this thing. Try not to let your biases get in front of you. Everyone's passionate about what they work on, but in the end, like users know what they like. So always A/B test everything, and make data-driven decisions. And here's my final lesson. Empower bottom-up innovation in your org, and amazing things will happen. So I think this is like the most important thing to me of Discover Weekly was, again, it wasn't this top-down model, right? We were empowered at Spotify to spend X percentage of our time, 10% of our time working on things we were passionate about. This was just a bunch of engineers who had a passion for music recommendations and personalization. And didn't ask a whole lot of questions and just kind of built something and threw it out there. And that's how it happened. So if you're able to empower this sort of mindset and this sort of thinking in your company, I think amazing things are going to happen. That's it. Thanks. Is there time? We're way over. OK. Thanks, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, question. So for that, it sounds like, was that a Bayesian Bennett approach then?
So no. So it wasn't like it wasn't a bandit in a sense of like you'd go into your playlist and some percentage we might choose a bad one or not. It was when we're training the model, we have positives and negative feedback. We offset that by sampling a bunch of random stuff and saying those were negatives. Yeah. Yeah.
What is the role of more human-based recommendations in the back end as one of the models that you kind of ensemble together, both in the beginning and the end? So like, you know, you were talking a little bit about time spent in the entire list or saves and skips, but like, what about, do I like the list? Do I feel like it gets me? And then also like, you know, in the back end, just in terms of humans figuring out what people like for music as compared to.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And that's like, there's all these articles that are always written like humans versus machines, like, you know, Apple's trying to be like human music, Spotify's all machines. Like, I think, you know, I hope I'm answering this question right, but I think there's kind of two things to it. One is I think, you know, all the models that we're building at Spotify, they're all based on human data, right? They're based on what users are streaming, or they're based on what users are human curating in playlists, right? So there is this human element to it. We're just mining through that human element. A human could look at a bunch of playlists and discern from that, like, okay, these artists are related. I see them showing up in the same playlists over and over again. A human can do that. But we're just doing it with, you know, with loads of data and finding patterns. So that's one thing of it. I think the other side of your question was like rather than just look at like, you know, positive and negative, they played it or they didn't, is there some way to gather a deeper feeling of how they liked this thing? I think that's really interesting. I think it's just difficult to measure, right? You have to at some point say, okay, this is how we're going to measure positive and negative feedback. And we're doing it super naively. A play is a positive, and a skip of less than 30-second played is a negative. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question, kind of. Okay.
Yeah. What's the, like you've got the four main sources, the metadata, the audio, the code views, the text. Have you done like some kind of an importance measurement as to how they break down?
Yeah, the collaborative filtering by far outperforms everything. So, and actually more than anything, the collaborative filtering based on playlists.
And does audio play at all?
It does. Yeah, actually one interesting place that audio has been really useful is in sequencing the songs. So let's say you listen to 3 different genres. You listen to heavy metal and like chill acoustic and something else in between. We don't want to like jump from like Iron Maiden to like Julian Baker in the same playlist, right? So it'll be more of like a flow, like looking at the audio and trying to solve a traveling salesman problem of which we know.
What kind of space do you represent the audio in?
So we represent it, everything we do is latent factor models. We basically embed everything down to some latent factor vector, 100 dimensions or whatever. But to do that, we look at an audio spectrogram, which is essentially a time frequency graph. Yeah, feel free to grab me later. I can talk more about that. I'm sure we're probably out of time, so probably end it there. Thank you.